Yeah, so I'm not your keynote, but I also help plan this conference. I'm the Diversity and Sprints Chair, and I'm really excited to announce this particular keynote. It's a different format than just a traditional speech. I'll bring up Milana Lewis, and while she's walking up, I'll give you her intro. She's the CEO and co-founder of STEM. It's a platform that simplifies payments to musicians. And before that, she worked at United Talent Agency, where she helps social media creators find funding opportunities. And then I'd also like to bring up Sylvia. Sylvia will be interviewing Milana in a sort of fireside chat. Sylvia is the organizer of Pi Ladies in Los Angeles, and she's also a data scientist at Gracenote. So Sylvia is one of the people that particularly helps with getting all these events going on in this region. She was chair emeritus last year. She helped out a lot in getting the first Pi Data going, and it worked out so well that now we have the second one. So with that, round of applause for our keynote speaker and our interviewer.
Well, thank you again to everybody to join us today for Pi Data LA. I'm very excited to share the stage this morning with Milana Lewis. Milana and I actually go back all the way back to our undergrad days at UCLA when we were both in the fashion club, and here we are sharing the stage at Pi Data LA, so quite the journey. So just to kick us off, I wanted to kind of share with the audience a little bit of the lay of the land insofar as our conversation this morning. So in today's world of data abundance in the digital era, there's a wealth of information out there. That said, not all of that information is either clear nor actionable. So I'm really excited for you to share with us and the audience your perspective on how you came to found the company STEM Disintermedia and your journey leading you there, as well as your perspective on the difference between data transparency and data clarity.
Sure.
So if you could maybe just share with the audience a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what led you to start the company, what inspired you.
Yeah, definitely. So the simple idea behind STEM is in this world where everyone has the opportunity to publish content directly to their fans and make money off of it because of all the various platforms that emerged. How do they share revenue from that content, right? Because no content is actually made independently. The notion of a DIY creator doesn't actually exist. There's always collaborators. So with music, there's songwriters, producers, labels. With video, there's directors, there's actors, there's screenwriters, etc. And so all of these people technically should be getting a piece of the revenue, and yet online, there's no easy way to automatically do that. And the way I came to the idea was when I was at United Talent Agency. So long story short, we met in college. I actually dropped out before my senior year because it was 2008 and I actually couldn't afford a loan. I wasn't qualified to be able to stay and pay out-of-state tuition at UCLA. I transferred over from Michigan State. And so the advice I got from someone I was interning for at the time who was a manager, he said, take the year off, go work at a talent agency. You're going to need to get that experience under your belt anyways if you want to work in Hollywood. And you'll establish residency, and then you'll graduate. So went into the mailroom at the time was William Morris Endeavor, thought I wanted to represent screenwriters and directors, and quickly started really analyzing my own personal consumption and realized that while I loved movies, I spent more time watching videos on the internet, right? Like spend more time consuming stories, narratives off of social media of my friends, and that fulfilled me. And I became fascinated with all of the new talent and IP that was emerging off these platforms, whether it was talent off of Twitter, so people creating Twitter accounts and generating content from that, and then that transitioning into movies and TV shows you now know, as well as the YouTube stars that sort of emerged, and wanted to represent those people. And that wasn't really a job back then. Like there wasn't a digital media agent.
Yeah, the early 2000s, I mean, the idea of a vlogger having some kind of like online stardom is at its inception.
And in fact, when I went to the talent agents at William Morris at the time and I said, hey, can I be a coordinator that discovers talent off the internet that you guys then sign? They started laughed at me and they said, that sounds like a really interesting intern opportunity, but not a job. This was like 2009 now. And so decided to go back to college and graduated, ended up dropping out of the film program at UCLA and wanted to study the audience. I became obsessed with how consumption has changed across various verticals and across various audiences. And so as I was graduating, I got a call from a colleague who I was consulting with. And he said, I know you don't want to be a talent agent, but UTA is hiring for a digital media agent. And so I took that opportunity, took the interview, and ended up taking the job because what inspired me was the mandate I was given, which was that they believed that technology was going to completely change their business. But as talent agents, they didn't feel threatened. Instead, they saw opportunity for all these platforms to enable their artists to go more direct to their fans and find unique ways of telling their stories and monetizing it. And they wanted me to be the person who could help figure out how to connect the dots, right? So if a client had an idea, how do they bring it to life? So it was everything from Rob Thomas, who's the creator of Veronica Mars, thinking about how do I take Veronica Mars, the TV show, and make it into a movie. And so we ended up partnering him up with Kickstarter and ran a whole campaign to raise money for that independently, if you guys are fans of Veronica Mars and follow that. It was comedians like Dane Cook and Aziz Ansari deciding to self-distribute their comedy specials instead of posting them or selling them to HBO and doing it direct through Twitter. So it was about all of that, and my job was to say, okay, here are the new platforms that exist in order for you to be able to do this more direct to your fans, and then also focus on how do companies like Netflix and Hulu, I know there's probably a number of you guys in the room here, how do they figure out what they're looking to buy, and how do we educate the talent agency internally on how to think about how they develop properties and sell them to Netflix and Hulu with their talent. And then the last thing that we had to figure out was how do we use data to analyze and predict the success of our project. So one of the projects I was involved with was how do we use sentiment analysis with volume based off the reaction that fans give when a movie trailer premieres, and how do we use that to predict box office opening weekend. So my job was sort of across the board, but alongside all of it, the conversations we kept having were with the talent. They would say, help me make more money independently. How do I do that? And given that at the time, now we're talking about 2012, there were all these different ways that you could distribute your content, right? So getting it out there wasn't the problem. There wasn't a problem about how do you monetize it, because all these services were starting to turn on monetization and new platforms were emerging as well. And it wasn't about how do I find my fans and how do I sell to them, because we're talking about named talent, right? Who have brand recognition, who know and have cultivated audiences directly through social media. But the number one reason why they would hesitate to go direct to their fans was because there is no easy way to pay their collaborators. And when you're working with projects at a high level scale, the problem wasn't just about how do I get it out there and make money. Well, now that I'm making money, how do I account to everyone else? And so I started looking at the ecosystem, looking at companies that were solving this in other businesses, right? So you have companies like Square and Stripe and Braintree that are building solutions for small to medium-sized businesses. And as a personal, human, there's all these financial tools that people have access to in order to manage their money and manage their P&L of their business. And I realized that no one was building this for the creative class. And the simple idea that I talked about in the beginning, how do you share revenue on a piece of content, was sort of like the impetus for the whole thought. And so that's really what inspired STEM. And what we do today is we decided to focus on music as the first vertical. So we are one of the top partners into Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, all the major music streaming services, a number of independent artists and independent labels, people like Frank Ocean, Keith Urban, as well as like some of the newer artists that if any of you go to music festivals and you see them performing from like 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, sort of the emerging guys, a lot of those use them as well and their managers to get their music onto the platforms. And then in return, once the music is performing, we collect the data and the revenue, and we distribute it not only to the uploader, who's the artist or the label, but we pay out all of the rights holders at the same time. And we're the only platform that gives every single person who's involved in the project a dashboard where they can track and see the data associated with the earnings. So we report to them on a monthly basis. It sounds really basic, but when we started in 2015, we were the only company to do that. And the big reason for it is because you sort of talk about transparency. versus clarity, this is a really big thing we focus on because a lot of artists have transparency to their data when they're going independent, but they're overwhelmed by it and paralyzed. And so the big thing we think about is how do we make data more clear? And so we decided to focus on aggregating the revenue data and putting data in dollars, because at the end of the day, when you're thinking about building a business, you think about how much money am I making, where is it coming from, and how do I continue to reinvest in myself?
So that raises, I think, a question in my mind, because oftentimes, like when, you know, a layperson like me, such as myself, I hear the words transparency and clarity, I think of them as synonymous. So how is it from your perspective that you delineate the difference between these ideas of transparency versus clarity, and how does that play into STEM's overall mission?
Yeah, definitely. Before I give, there's an analogy I'd like to think about, but before I do that, how many of you guys currently work at companies that service somehow entertainment, whether it's video or music? Awesome, okay. So when I think about transparency, I think about a story I heard about one of the most senior executives at the time who was running a record label. Today, he's working at one of the major platforms. In a meeting, his finance team shared with him that some of their biggest artists had requested to audit the record label for their finances, right? You keep hearing stories about artists feeling like they're getting screwed, them not knowing where the money is. That's a consistent narrative in the business that we operate in, unfortunately. And his response to that request was, that's great. If they want the data, give it to them, but give it to them in something that's as thick as the yellow pages so they never ask for it again. And that's, to me, transparency. It's like, you want data? Go. Here you go. What are you going to do with it, right? Like, how do you process, how do you analyze, how do you act on something that is so dense? And so when we approached it and when we think about it in terms of clarity, right? Because it's our job to almost be like the data janitors, right? How do we collect and aggregate all of the tremendous data that we get access to from Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, the 25 platforms that we currently work with? And how do we make it actionable for the end user? And what's been really interesting and challenging for us is thinking about who that end user is and what they need to do with the data, because that also is very different.
Yeah, so can you provide some examples on like maybe certain products that you offer at STEM that actually and maybe speak to certain data points that you track that help provide these artist-driven businesses gain clarity in order to make better informed decisions around, you know, say, for example, whether to collaborate or whether to take the lead on a specific piece of work that they'd like to explore further?
Yeah, definitely. So when we came into the business, right, this is 2015, so none of the music streaming services had artist-facing dashboards. At the time, actually, I believe that they legally weren't allowed to share like streaming data with artists directly, because this is when they were still negotiating with all the major labels, and the major labels wanted to control the power of the data. I think Spotify launched its first artist-facing dashboard in 2016, 2017. I think the only one that kind of existed was the Next Big Sound, which was acquired by Pandora. But otherwise, the biggest thing is that artists had no idea how much money they were making, right? And the thing in music is that the number of streams are a false positive, and they don't necessarily correlate to revenue because of all the different variables of how that revenue is calculated. So the first thing we wanted to answer for artists is, how much money is my content worth, right? Because if they're going to be negotiating deals on behalf of themselves, whether it's with them determining, do I stay independent and do this on my own, or do I sign with a major label, they need to know, well, how much am I making on my own? And so the first thing we wanted to show them was just how much revenue are they making for each song that they release. And then on the collaborator level, if you're a producer, if you're a songwriter, what's your share worth, right? What are your 5 to 10 to 20% of the song worth? It sounds really basic to us, but most creators have no idea what their share of the pie is actually worth. And giving that visibility was tremendously valuable, because now they can think more strategically about, how do I invest in my growth, right? So if I'm a songwriter or producer, it's quite oftentimes I'm thinking about, how do I invest my time? Do I continue to write songs for other people, or do I want to make my own music, right? And there's always a trade-off you have to think about. And so with STEM, they can see, great, I have 5% of songs when I produce when I'm a producer on them or a songwriter on them. And if these songs make a lot of money, my 5% could be worth more than 100% of my own music, right? And so how do I think about how I spend my time? That's one piece of it. We thought that there'd be a lot more intelligence and actionable insights to gain from looking at how much revenue each platform drives. But that was also interesting to find out that it's like, great, you know how much money you make more on Spotify versus Apple, but what are you going to do about that? Right? Like, are you not going to put your music on one of the platforms? Are you going to promote one over the other? Like, not really helpful.
Yeah. So, in that vein, can you speak to maybe some more of the consultative, services that STEM's providing currently to the artist business?
Yeah. So this year we made a really hard strategic decision to our business. We launched something called STEM Direct. And when we started STEM, we have always been invite only. And we grew a user base that included a big part of the DIY segment, right? And one thing we learned is that the pain points and the needs of DIY artists are very different than artists who are career artists versus hobbyists, and artists who have management teams behind them or independent labels. The types of data they care about, the things that they're looking for as levers to grow their business are very different. And as many of you know, if you're working at a startup, the number one thing that kills a startup is lack of focus. And so we had to make a really hard choice to focus and double down on a segment that we knew we could super serve that everyone else was underserving. And so with that, we launched STEM Direct. And with STEM Direct, it's both the platform and the tools, plus each artist and their management team have a dedicated account manager in STEM. And the reason for that is twofold. One, the process of content distribution requires a little bit of handholding because there's a strategy component to it. But number two is because most artists and their management teams actually don't know how to analyze the data. And so after they put out a release, even though we give them a dashboard of insights of how that release is doing, both in terms of financial data and now more recently trending data, they don't know what to do with it. And so we realized that the way we can help them learn how to drive value is instead of like doing the work for them like a record label does, it's how do we teach them to analyze the data, right? So a lot of our account management team right now is serving kind of like lightweight data analysts where they're helping to support the artists by looking into their data. And one thing we continue to sort of debate internally is how much do we invest in building some of these views in these tools inside the dashboard. And what we decided strategically for the short term is, honestly, let's aggregate the data and build custom reports because every artist, what we're seeing is that they have different things they want to see. And once we realize that we start generating similar types of reports over and over again, then we'll actually invest in building it into the dashboard. But when you give artists and their teams too much modularity within the dashboard to create their own views, they won't do it. Like they don't know what answers they're they don't know what questions they're looking to answer, and therefore they don't know what views to build.
Right. So that kind of like, you don't want to lead them down back to the path of like how you're thinking about transparency and just kind of
you
focus
paralyze them because
right.
You give them too many options,
it's
too many things
paralysis.
to do. Analysis paralysis, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So can you, I would imagine that like as you continue to grow the business, another challenge that you have in addition to going with a product like STEM Direct and choosing to move forward in that direction in terms of product decisions, like what other challenges do you face and how do you use data internally to address those?
Yeah, we actually think about it. We put ourselves in the shoes of our users quite a bit, right? And one thing that we realize is that as a startup, there's a couple of core metrics you absolutely need to know, right? You need to understand where you're getting your users from, how much they're worth, what the cost of acquisition is, what your churn rates look like. And these are basic business functions that artists need to know too. So as we learn how to analyze them for ourselves, we're just an aggregator, right? But the same questions that we ask ourselves are the same questions that some of our users ask who are music managers or who are labels, because they're aggregating talent as well and assets, and they need to analyze these things. They want to know what's the value of their catalog, what's their cost of acquiring a fan or a listener, how much is their catalog worth, what's the lifetime value of a release, what's the decay rate, right? So we're analyzing it internally and externally at the same time, which has been really interesting. But the hardest metric for us to measure has been churn. And this is sort of going into some of the nuisances of the business that we're in. So we have our artists fall into generally two buckets. Those buckets are big established names, people like Keith Urban, who are legacy artists that are well known and decided to be independent, right? Or they're emerging artists who are just starting their careers, in which case there's a lot of growth opportunity for them. With every new release, they gain an audience, that release grows their fan base, and their general catalog grows as well. And now the business is almost 5 years old, will be 5 in April, but the typical new artist career really takes 3 to 4 years to take off. And about a year ago, we started seeing tremendous amount of churn. But we couldn't measure churn the right way because we experience hard churn and soft churn.
So what's the difference to you?
Sure. So hard churn is much easier to define. That's when a user or an artist uploads content to STEM, and then for one reason or another, they remove it from STEM and move it to a different platform. That could happen because the artist gets signed to a major record label and they have to move all of their copyrights away from being independent to STEM over to that major label, or because they decide that they want to take the music down, they don't like it, they want to change the direction of the sound they're going in. There's multiple reasons, right? Soft churn is actually much harder to measure. Soft churn is when an artist releases a number of things through STEM and then decides to use a record label or another distributor for their next project, but they keep their music on STEM. And the reason that's hard to measure is because oftentimes their revenue keeps growing even though they're not releasing new content in the platform. And so with some artists, like Sheck Wes is a really great example, if you guys follow hip hop at all. But we had Sheck Wes's Mamba really early on in the STEM system. And then he signed with a major record label, put out an album. That track started going like this. But we don't have his business anymore. So how do you measure churn when you see like significant artist growth off of an upload and you're not getting any future releases, right? So that's been really challenging for us. It's also exciting, but it makes looking at LTV even more challenging, right? Because if they keep their assets in the system, the lifetime value keeps growing of the user, even though there's no more cost to serve. So our metrics as an operations business, like looking at the operational unit metrics of our business, is kind of funky.
Well, that sounds like something that you're going to be continuing to explore with your team. So that's, I think overall in the industry, like it's just, I think the business that you started, I commend you because it has to be drawn from inspiration given all the nuance and challenges of the ecosystem itself and kind of the vast range of everyone from small and emerging independent artists to well-known names. So with that said, like, is there anything else that like you'd like to share with the audience insofar as like any additional insights that you've gained in say maybe just the last year, in the most recent year that you've grown as a business?
Yeah, definitely. I think the one thing we think a lot about here, and I imagine you guys are thinking about this as well from your various jobs, is how do you use data to predict growth, right? And we look at it in a couple of different ways. So on one hand, we put ourselves in the shoes of an artist and we say, okay, what are the things that they think about that they believe to be levers in growing their business? And right now, one of the unfortunate things, and you probably know a lot about this, is playlisting and curation, right? The curation algorithms that many of the platforms have developed are intended to drive diversity of consumption across the platform, right? And it's been interesting to see how it evolved from being human creation to algorithmic back to human, and now they're sort of struggling to figure out which direction they go because there needs to be an element of human curation to some extent. And so artists care about how do I get my song playlisted, right? Any of you guys use Spotify or Apple and discover your music through playlists or Release Radar? Great. So if I'm an artist, all I'm thinking about is how do I get my music in front of you when you open up the app, right? And there's so many nuisances to it. And one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how do we hack the algorithm or help our artists hack the algorithm in order to get recognition? And the answer is just put yourself in the shoes of the fan, right? That's not the only answer, but it's a big one because at the end of the day, what you guys are thinking about is what are these passion indicators, right? Well, we're thinking about what is the reaction score that you guys are analyzing to figure out how to recommend something. And so a lot of the time that we're spending right now is thinking through that, right? So we spent we spent so much time analyzing all of the API points that we have available to us. And then we realized like, oh, you know what, maybe let's not think about what can we build based on the data we have available. Let's think about it from what I said earlier, which is what does a fan do when they discover new music, right? So you open up your app, you put a playlist on, you hear a song you like, what's the action you take? You probably like the song. Or you click through to see who the artist is and read more about them. Maybe you share it, right? These are all passion indicators. And so what we think about a lot now is, well, how are they weighed, right? And how do we surface that data to a user so that they can drive insights from it? Because if they get added to New Music Fridays, right, what's the call to action? How do they monetize, not monetize, how do they maximize that opportunity? It gives them an initial spike, but what can they do? Do they, instead of tweeting their song out to their fans, so we say, add it to a playlist, right? How do they drive more interactivity that drive some of these passion indicators so that their song has more reaction?
Right, which ultimately does tie back to, I think, an artist's end goal in terms of driving more revenue to their overall business. And again, another way of like helping them inform their decision making on how to create. Like, have you gotten feedback from any of your customers insofar as like the services that you provide and how it influenced maybe some of their decision making? Can you provide an example?
Yeah, there's been tons of that, and I'll talk about it in a second. But the one thing I want to add is that there is a huge delay and lag in connecting the data between the trending metrics that I'm talking about, right? Because we have daily data analytics we pull that give us these insights around sort of where the streams are coming from, how many user-generated playlist ads, how many favorites, how many likes are happening from the songs, and who the customers are that are doing it. Not who the customers are, but how many of them are there, right? Like sort of the volume metrics around that. And we don't get financial data until net 60, net 90 days, right? So even though you see the trending data analytics, you can't connect that to revenue right away. And that's one of the problems that we'd love to solve, but it'll be a while until we can get there. But in terms of some of the insights and problems we've been able to solve for users, there's a couple of sort of funny stories. So one thing that's become really interesting is that the types of people who are added as shareholders in STEM have changed. It's not what we thought it was initially. We thought it would be your creators, like your collaborators, the people who you work with to make the music, your songwriters, your producers, maybe your label. What we're seeing now is more and more people who help support and service the content are being added in as shareholders. So the marketing person, the social media coordinator, if an artist decides to hire a radio promo person to work the record at radio, they give them a piece of the back and add them as a shareholder. And then more recently, we're starting to see artists add in investors. And so what they're doing is they're saying, hey, my music and my assets are generating this much money per month. I need money for my next project. I'm going to go to my friends and family, and I can show them my STEM dashboard to show them exactly how much money I'm making. And then I can add them in as a shareholder, and they'll get paid directly. And the way we realized this is because in our support threads, we had users coming to us saying, hey, can I add someone as a shareholder and change the contract? And we started seeing that more and more. And so we started asking the question, well, why? Who are these people? And they were added as a role of other. And we just reached out to a couple of users, and we found out that a number of them were seeking independent investors and friends and family, and we're enabling them to recoup directly in the application. And so now we're thinking about, okay, how do we facilitate that experience more seamlessly and with less friction? So that's one side of it. The other one is more interesting. So many of our users, I should say, not some, are based in Atlanta. We're pretty heavy in the hip hop urban genre. And we started seeing Icebox as a shareholder. Do any of you know who that is? Probably not. Icebox is a jewelry store in Atlanta. And I called my director of new business who focuses on Atlanta, and I said, Jason, why are they a shareholder? Do they start a record label? Like, what's going on? And he's like, no, get this. Some of our rappers have layaway fees that they're using STEM to pay back. So it's been really interesting what our users are using when we enable you to share revenue with anyone. And I don't know how much data or insights they care about on the music consumption. I think they just care about being able to track how much money they're getting paid back. But I think it's amazing that we're able to drive a level of visibility that informs an artist on how they can be smarter about their business.
Well, it sounds like STEM's kind of expanding into the whole of like the artist business's P&L, not just like direct expenses regarding to collaborators or producers, but other aspects of things that they may consider expenses to manage their like brand image and so on, like Icebox.
Well, and that's absolutely true, right? Like our mission at the end of the day is how do we enable creators to build sustainable businesses? And the thing that we believe prevents them from doing so today is that they simply don't have visibility into their finances. And so when you turn the lights on for them and they can see how much money they're making, where it's coming from, and track how they're investing in it, in their content across that, they can be smarter about their business, right? And they don't
decide where it goes.
Yeah, and they don't have to make really poor decisions about how they invest in themselves, right? Oftentimes, they end up taking really unfortunate deals from whether it's major labels or other sources of capital because they can't go to a bank and say, hey, give me a small business loan. Most banks don't understand how to credit an artist, right? How do you value their music or their assets when it's inconsistent? And I think that for us is one of the biggest and most exciting opportunities to think through is given the data that we have and given the knowledge that we have about all the nuisances that impact the financial picture of a creator's career and business, how do we help them gain access to not only financial tools, but financial services? Because at the end of the day, that's what drives their sustainability, right? Every business needs a way to sustain itself through access to capital, whether it's through revenue growth or through investment.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced area. I mean, in my background prior to data science, having worked in credit and loans, it's not that kind of P&L and balance sheet is not something that's like easily underwritten or anything that there's like a formulaic way of evaluating credit for. So it's really interesting work that you're trying to provide. So in terms of STEM supporting artist businesses, in some ways, I almost think of STEM as like tangential, if not touching on like a fintech company.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we'd love to be. I'll be honest, like we're far from that still, but that's definitely the direction we want to go in. I think that there's so many tools that we, as the general public, have at our disposal to manage our money today that very specific segments of the rest of the population lack for their business. And if we can solve that for the creative population, everything from financial tools to small to medium-sized business tools around accounting, revenue management, basic data insights, I think we can really move the needle and disrupt the business in a way that hasn't been possible before. Because for the most part, if you were an artist, you needed to sign away to a major record label and hope that there was someone there that was going to push your business, and then pray to God you'd see the money from it beyond the initial advance. And times have definitely changed, and what we're seeing is this unbundling of the major label business, where more and more artists are choosing to be independent because they can be, and they are taking their business into their control. They're hiring the teams of people to work for them directly versus relying on a big one-stop shop. And so a lot of the questions that they didn't have to worry about answering before because the major label would have the infrastructure and the people in-house to do it for them, now it's on them and their management team to figure out. And so how do we build tools that give them the ability to simplify that, but give them the power and the intelligence to really grow?
That's great. I think this is a good place to open it up for questions from the audience, if there are any.
There's one back there.
Hi. Your point about how can you help artists sort of maximize their music for the Spotify algorithm? It kind of just feels like the new wave of like search engine optimization, except now the search engine is Spotify or SoundCloud or wherever you get your music from. So I was kind of curious if you've already sort of seen some of the ways that this has affected how music has been developed, because you're optimizing it for Spotify. And I know I recently watched a segment on Hassan Minaj's show where he talked about how hip hop now it's like these 2-minute tracks because you're optimizing for number of plays on Spotify because that's how you make money. So I was curious if you've seen any sort of other trends similar to what has been seen in hip hop.
Yeah, we talk about this quite a bit, and I talk about it a lot with some of the songwriters and producers who've been in the business for decades, right? And if you start listening to music, you'll pay attention, notice this. You have 15 seconds to grab the attention. So even the way a song is structured, we're seeing people move the hook up into the first 20 seconds of a song because a lot of discovery is driven through playlists. And with things like New Music Friday and Release Radar, they're not cohesive playlists, right? They'll mix genres from artists you follow. And so you might have a down-tempo, like melodic track, and then followed right after by a big indie pop hit, followed by country, followed by R&B, depending on how diverse your listening taste is, right? And so that doesn't really flow, and so it interrupts the experience. And for a user, a lot of them skip the song if they don't like it. So how do you maximize that? That's one thing. The other thing that I've noticed quite a bit is people don't give songs a chance anymore, right? Like, there's this chicken and egg scenario between the streaming world and the radio world, right? It used to be that you needed radio to break as an artist. And then streaming came along and it's like, no, anyone can break through streaming, right? You can discover your fan base through SoundCloud or through Google or through Spotify. And so to sort of touch on your question about SEO, it's so different by platform, right? So YouTube is purely SEO driven, a lot of it, right? There's a bit of human curation, but you'll get things recommended based on features, so in keywords, right? So if you're a young artist and you're featured on a Chance the Rapper song, you're likely to get discovered and your music is likely to get heard because it's going to be the next song after someone decides to listen to Chance. Doesn't necessarily work that way on Spotify, nor does it work that way at Apple. And so we have to think about, well, what is driving these algorithms? Because the sort of SEO nature of it's very different per platform, which is also one of the challenges about how we decide to give insights to artists because it depends on per platform, like what metrics matter and what data points matter. But going back to what sort of the other part of it is the radio and streaming world. Now radio wants to see how the song is doing in streaming, right? So how did the song perform after its first week? And if it doesn't get the reaction in the first week, that song may not have a life. And that is so sad because music needs to be heard over and over again in various contexts to resonate. I hope many of you can sort of relate to that. How many times have you heard a song and it took you until like the 10th or 20th time to hear it to be like, oh, I actually like it, right? Like there's so much music you hear and you're like, I don't like that. Right away you want to skip it, but then somehow you keep hearing it and it starts resonating. It's so contextual, and I'm concerned that the context out of music discovery and artist discovery is at stake given how much focus there is on the curation element and the reactivity.
I had a question. It's more on the soft skill side of things. I work at a law firm, so one of our biggest challenges is trying to convince our users that what we're doing from a data perspective is beneficial for them. I could see a lot of that probably being the same challenges that you have. How do you go about tackling that?
Can you drill in a little bit more so I can answer it more specifically?
Sure. For example, we are doing a client retention project on the law firm side. And we can predict, let's say, very high accuracy whether or not a client's going to leave us or not. Pitching that to a stakeholder is a little bit difficult because even if, let's say, you have 80% accuracy on your prediction, they see a very big company about to leave you that you're inaccurate about. They want to throw the entire project away, or maybe they're not as apt to listen. So I imagine from your perspective, trying to convince artists or just anybody to join your platform because now they have access to data, how do you convince them that this platform is beneficial for them?
That's why we didn't start just as a data analytics platform, right? We went straight to the money. Everyone wants to get paid.
Got it.
And so that was our hook. If we can make it easier for you not to have to chase money as a shareholder, you're going to create a network effect that's going to drive more users, right? So our biggest growth lever has been the fact that early on, if you're uploading a song, you add shareholders, those shareholders get invited to STEM, they convert to get paid, and most of the time, they're songwriters and producers, right? These people are sort of nodes in the network. They collaborate with tons of an artists throughout even a week. Like a typical songwriter producer will sit with 5 or 7 artists on a weekly basis. out of maybe 150 songs they produce, a dozen of them make it out into the real world, maybe even less. These are sort of high-level metrics that I'm making up on the spot. But our biggest conversion funnel was through just collaborators. It was shareholders who had a great experience, got paid quickly. And if you're a shareholder and you're collaborating in the next project and that artist is independent, you have an opportunity to influence what platform they use to distribute their music, you're going to recommend STEM. And so we started seeing a lot of growth through the network through collaborators converting. But what's funny about the music business is some artists don't want to deal with the data, right? Yeah. And so at any given moment, we always in meetings ask about what does the ratio look like. And so we think about this like pie chart, right? And we think about how big is the slice that's going to be representing the decision based on data, like how much of it's data informed and how much of it's FOMO. And most of the time when we have these conversations with people, we realize that the data informed piece unfortunately represents maybe like 20 to 25% of the picture, and the rest of it is FOMO.
Got it. Okay.
Any plans for expanding to writers?
To screenwriters or
No, writers, book writers, novel
Oh my
writers.
God, I'd love to.
Okay.
I mean, the big vision is to really build this for the creative class, right? So not just musicians. I think music for us was the first vertical. I don't know which one the second one is next, to be honest. It could, but the verticals we really look at for the future involve everything from, I think e-publishing is really exciting. Writers, not only in terms of authoring books, but writers who are contributors to publications, right? And are freelance workers and work across multiple platforms. I think there's a huge opportunity for these publishers to offer revenue share on a per article basis based on the way it's performing. I feel like that's going to be a future. And so if that exists, would be great to simplify how those publishing companies pay out their shareholders or their collaborators and their contributors. We look at e-gaming a lot. That's an exciting space that is also one that just lacks a tremendous amount of transparency. The gamers who play for some of the leagues, one, the waterfall of when they get paid is so delayed, and there's so many middlemen as well, but there's also such lack in transparency and reporting there. We're in video today, so we can share revenue off a YouTube video. I think that since we're in this room, hopefully someday Netflix and Hulu will share consumption data with the rights owners and maybe even pay out on the back end. And if that happens, I'd love to get into long form video. And then I think e-commerce is really big too. If you think about all of the independent storefronts that exist with the small brands that are growing quickly on platforms like Shopify, and how they're collaborating with each other and how they probably have multiple people they need to pay royalties to, whether it's designers or manufacturers. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
So I was wondering if you currently have a function for trading those shares, because if you allow for shares to be traded and eventually to have some sort of market, there's a lot of information that you can then gather from that trading information to use for your predictions, right?
Yeah, how do I say this? So there's a couple of companies that are currently doing this, right? There's companies like Vest, there's SongTrader, there's Royalty Exchange. They're companies that allow a shareholder to sell their shares in songs, and it's more of a marketplace function. We decided that that's not the route we want to go in. I think that it's definitely an opportunity, but what we are more interested in right now is having that person understand the value of their shares, and if they want to trade it independently, they can. But there's a couple of announcements that we're going to make in the beginning of the year that'll give you more insight into the direction we're heading in when it comes to how do you access capital as a shareholder.
Great, thanks. Are you going to be able to stick around to answer a few more questions if the audience has any?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your time and for joining us here at PyData LA and for sharing your insights and perspective. It's been really interesting to hear about what inspired you to start STEM and STEM's journey. So with that, if the audience could join me in thanking Milana once more with a round of applause.
Thank you all.